Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Captain Patriotic. I hope everybody's doing well, and I hope everyone had a wonderful time for Christmas this year with your family and everybody, as well as a wonderful new year. I can't tell you guys enough, but I am super excited for what 2025 is going to offer. I have a lot of major plans for the channel, new topics, interesting discussions, and everything in between. It's definitely stick tuned for what comes in store for us. As you guys will recall, the last handful of videos that I have recorded, I've mostly talked about the Korean War, and I wanted to do that to highlight the importance of that otherwise mostly unknown or less popular conflict altogether. I really appreciate all the support that I've had with this series, and I am doing the best I can to shine light on a few things that our Korean War veterans may have experienced in their time in the military. So I figured, what better way to wrap up this mini-series than talking about an icon, the last living Medal of Honor recipient for the Korean War. And let me tell you guys, it's a very, very intriguing story, and it was awarded to a very selfless individual that put his life on the line multiple times, not for fame and glory, but to help serve his country the way that he knew that he wanted to. So guys, buckle up, get you a drink, get you a snack. Let's go dive on into this good stuff. The last living Medal of Honor recipient who was awarded for actions during the Korean War goes to none other than Ralph Puckett Jr. He was a U.S. Army officer as well as an Army Ranger throughout much of his Army career. In fact, he is most notable for leading the 8th Army Ranger Company during the Korean War and was initially awarded the Army Distinguished Service Cross, which, for those of us that may or may not be familiar with the military decorations, basically the Distinguished Service Cross is the second highest military honor that any member of the Army can receive for bravery, valor, and gallantry in action in a combat zone. It is only second behind the Congressional Medal of Honor as far as prestigious awards go. So it's still a big freaking deal, you guys, to be awarded this honor regardless. But anyway, he was initially awarded the Distinguished Service Cross and later on the Medal of Honor for actions that he took part in on November 25th, 1950, whenever his company of 51 Army Rangers were attacked by several hundred Communist and Chinese soldiers at the Battle for Hill 205 in northern South Korea or southern North Korea. It was somewhere in the middle of the Korean peninsula. After the Korean War, he later served in Vietnam, where he officially retired from the Army in 1971 with the rank of colonel. And after being appointed on July 19th, 1996, he would go on to serve as the honorary colonel of the 75th Ranger Regiment, which is one of the premier regiments within the U.S. Army Rangers, for sure. Puckett grew up in a small town of Tifton, Georgia on December 8th, 1926. Him and his family, it was a medium-sized family growing up in rural Georgia, but he grew up during the height of the Great Depression, so unlike a lot of families at that time, they struggled to make ends meet and to basically live through this horrific time in U.S. history. But nonetheless, he pulled through all of that hardship and attended Tifton High School before transferring and finishing high school at Baylor School in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Now, this is significant because his dad was actually a World War I veteran, and so was his uncles, and they instilled in him military service to the core. And hence, the reason he transferred to Baylor School in Chattanooga was because it was one of the few military academies at the time in the southern United States. Well, he would finally graduate from there in 1943, and as long as he was going there, and even back in his home state of Georgia, he was actively involved in the Boy Scouts of America, and even obtained the rank of Eagle Scout in 1943, shortly before he graduated from high school. Well, after he obtains that honor and he graduates from high school, he enrolls in Georgia Tech shortly before ultimately enlisting in the U.S. Army for service in World War II. He tried the whole academic thing, and he was an okay student, but he knew that he wanted to serve his country like his dad and his uncles did in World War I, and he knew the Army would take just about anybody, so that's partially why he enlisted in that particular branch. Other than that, and it's one of the, if not the biggest branch in the U.S. military even to this day. So whenever he enlists in the U.S. Army in 1943, he chose to go into the U.S. Army Air Corps Reserve in 1943 in order to become an Army pilot. In fact, he would go on to undertake his pre-aviation cadet training at Georgia Tech, where he was going to school. However, with a disinterest or a glut of trained pilots, the program was ultimately disbanded and no more. Even at that, Puckett tried to remain in that particular service, but after it became clear that there would be no chance at flight training like he really wanted to do, he ultimately decided to be discharged. This was a couple years later in 1945. He actually obtained an appointment to the U.S. Military Academy in July of 1945, just as World War II was wrapping up. Even though he technically was U.S. Army, where they get deployed basically everywhere around the world during World War II, he was never deployed overseas to Europe or the Pacific for that matter, and thus never saw action during World War II. However, it was his experiences as a cadet, or hopeful cadet, I should say, in the Air Corps, that he would go on to gain the reputation as both a very good soldier and as well as a very solid leader later on in one of the U.S. Army's most elite special forces organizations at the time. So after World War II ends in September of 1945, he basically just stays in his home state of Georgia, not doing much of anything. He's a civilian at this point and just kicking it back and relaxing with his family. This goes on for a few years, and he's still at the United States Military Academy, mind you. In fact, he actually graduated from there in 1949. While he was there doing his studies and what have you, he also captained the Army boxing team because he was so physically fit and everything. And upon graduating from the military academy, he was commissioned as an Army infantry second lieutenant and was therefore deployed to Japan, where he got the gumption and the drive to be assigned to the U.S. Army Rangers, because in the back of his mind, if he couldn't be a pilot, the Rangers was the next best thing that could get him into combat and to best serve his country. Now, when he was originally seeking to volunteer for service with the Rangers, he was informed that there was no more lieutenant positions in the 8th Army Ranger Company, which was stationed in Japan at that time. And his response to that was that he would take a squad leader's or rifleman's job or several positions, several grades lower than a lieutenant's if it meant that he could be a part of the Rangers. That's how bad he wanted to be a part of the Rangers, because he knew a bunch of friends that actually served in the Rangers in both theaters of World War II, and he knew that they were a bunch of badasses that he really, really wanted to be. He wasn't about to let anything get in the way of his dream this time. He was damn determined to get into it. Now, based on his responses at that particular moment, a certain Colonel McGee, who was in charge of forming the company, was so impressed by Ralph Puckett's attitude that he gave him the company commander's position in the Rangers regardless. Now, that was because a position of this much importance was oftentimes reserved for captains, which is a slightly higher rank than the second lieutenant rank that he has right now. But nonetheless, he basically won the colonel's attitude, and he won his way into the Rangers that way. So therefore, throughout the rest of 1949 and most of 1950, he goes through a bunch of rigorous training, the Ranger School, the typical Army Ranger training to get himself physically and mentally fit for combat, which when he first signed up, he didn't think there was going to be another war anytime soon. But we know history always changes, right? And that's exactly the thought that he went through his mind whenever Korea started in June of 1950. He's like, oh crap, I'm really going to have to know all these skills, because I'm really going to have to go fight for my country and test myself in combat, even though I really, really want to do this. If anyone that's been in the military could probably attest to this, but I would only imagine a special forces organization like the Army Rangers would have tougher training than a typical U.S. Army recruit. That's because the Rangers, they have special missions that they go on, oftentimes behind enemy lines, to where they need as much specialized training and skills as possible to carry out whatever missions are assigned to them. They basically were the tip of the spear for the U.S. Army, and they oftentimes would go into some of the most dangerous missions of the whole service branch. That's why this is such a big deal to Puckett, and now he's going to have a chance to finally prove himself in combat. And he will very, very shortly. Fast forward a few months to October 11th, 1950, and the 8th Army Ranger Company, including Puckett, entered the Korean War, where they specialized in conducting raids both during the daytime as well as at nighttime behind enemy lines. So he goes through a couple skirmishes in October 1950, and he's really getting his feet wet as far as like live combat experience. But nonetheless, those pivotal moments from those handful of first battles was really crucial to this very next significant battle that he would become a part of, and which would define his Army career. Fast forward about a month and a half later to November 25th, 1950, where Puckett and his company of 51 Army Rangers were ordered to capture a significant fortified enemy hill called Hill 205. Now, this was very important because this was a Chinese and communist strategic point overlooking the Chungcheong River and was essential to the Battle of the Chungcheong River. Basically, if the Rangers were to take over this hill, then that would give them a pivotal point and a pivotal advantage to their further advance of communist forces back into North Korea. That's why this hill was so important at the time, because This was probably one of the most dangerous and fortified hills and the hardest to take over objectives at that time during the Korean War. But nonetheless, Puckett led his Rangers during this attack and shouted words of encouragement while getting support fire from a nearby tank on the enemy. Now, after a bunch of heavy fighting, and whenever his platoon was pinned down, he personally ran across an open area 3 times to draw enemy fire away from his boys so that they could advance and take over this hill. And by doing so, this allowed the other Rangers in his company to locate and destroy enemy positions in order to ultimately seize Hill 205 from the North Koreans and Chinese. Now, after capturing this hill, the Ranger Company was well over a mile from the nearest friendly Army and U.S. unit. And because of this, Puckett personally coordinated artillery support prior to the incoming Chinese counterattack of them taking over Hill 205. Well, at 10 p.m. that night, the Chinese began their attack on the Rangers by firing a mortar barrage against them. There were 6 waves of Chinese forces in total that assaulted this hill during that night, with the first 5 waves attacking the hill for 4 hours straight. Basically, it was relentless waves of Chinese soldiers just storming up this hill to try to retake their position from the Rangers. Several times during this ensuing battle, Puckett was forced to call in danger close artillery fire, which basically means that he was forced to call artillery fire, if not on top of him and his men, but very extremely close to them, to where they had a possible risk of friendly fire to severely injure and kill their own soldiers. But hey, that is how close these Chinese soldiers were. I mean, they were damn determined to take over this hill back from the U.S. forces at any means necessary. I mean, they were very relentless. It was crazy, crazy. Because of this would go on for the first 5 waves against the Chinese soldiers, and it was pretty dang effective too. And it basically halted them in their tracks. Things would change because it was during that 6th and final wave of Chinese soldiers that, even though Puckett was talking to the men on the radio, they were unable to provide more artillery support because they had expended all the shells that they could at that time and basically were out of ammo to support the Rangers. And it was because of this that all the Rangers, including Puckett, would resort to hand-to-hand melee combat, basically with their fists and knives, bayonets, whatever the heck they could get their hands on to basically kill and outrun these Chinese soldiers. It was an onslaught for sure. Now, because of this brutal hand-to-hand combat, it was very dangerous. It was extremely dangerous. Puckett himself, by the time the 6th wave had come through, and through the middle of it, he suffered a thigh wound, as well as incurred several wounds to his feet, his butt, and an arm when 2 enemy mortar shells landed in his foxhole. Now, after those wounds basically completely immobilized him to where he basically could not move at all. I mean, he was losing function of his feet whatsoever. Puckett himself ordered his Rangers to leave him behind and abandon the position because the enemy was simply too much for them, and he knew that his men could not keep this up whatsoever because they were running out of ammunition. So that's when he made the ultimate decision to sacrifice himself to halt the enemy to let his men go, which is bold and courageous in himself. I mean, that is insane, but I give him a lot of props for doing that. Now, the majority of the remaining Rangers that were left under his command, they followed his orders and they retreated back to safety. While that's going on, two Rangers actually decided to stay behind to help him, David Pollock and Billy Walls, where they were doing everything they could to rescue their beloved leader. And in the process of doing so, the two of them shot 3 Chinese soldiers who were within a few yards of Puckett's foxhole, where he was holed up to basically halt the enemy. And after taking out those handful of Chinese soldiers, the two of those men successfully evacuated Puckett from the hill before he became unconscious from blood loss and everything. Now, as these men were carrying him off the hill, Puckett had just enough strength and enough breath left in him to call for an artillery fire to hit the hill to basically blow up their position to halt the enemy. Now, his wounds were so serious at that time that he would be hospitalized for 11 months, almost a year, due to the various injuries that he would suffer that very night. At the time, his actions would not go unnoticed by any means. In fact, a lot of people hailed him as a hero, especially within his company or platoon that he was leading that night. For his actions during the Battle of Hill 205, Puckett was initially awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, as well as 2 Purple Heart medals for the injuries that he sustained that day trying to lead his men and to basically act as a one-man counterattack against the enemy. While the 2 Rangers that rescued him, Pollock and Walls, they would go on to receive the Silver Star Medal for gallantry in the rescue of him from sheer doom and death. Now, the Silver Star is a really big deal, you guys. Basically, that is the 3rd highest military medal that any member of any branch of the military can receive for valor and bravery in combat. The only 2 medals that are more superior to these is the service crosses, like the Distinguished Service Cross that Puckett just received, and then the Medal of Honor, of course, is the king of all medals. We'll get into that very, very shortly, you guys. So anyway, that was a very harrowing and near-death experience for Puckett, and you think, well, if I was this close to death, would I want to continue to put my life on the line for my country? Do I want to stay in the foxhole and in the trenches with my boys, or do I just want to live a comfortable life back at home away from the battlefield? Well, ultimately, while he was recuperating in the hospital, Puckett made the ultimate decision to stay and make a career out of the U.S. Army because they treated him so well, and he felt like he owed it to the men that he lost during Korea. Following the conclusion of the Korean War, and after recovering, Puckett served over 2 years in the U.S. Army Infantry School of the Ranger Department as commander of the Mountain Ranger Division. And while serving as the first Ranger advisor in the Army in a mission to Colombia, he personally planned and established the Colombian Army Ranger School. And later, he would command Company B and C teams in the 10th Special Forces Group in Germany in the late 50s and into the mid-60s. Now, fast forward a little bit to 1967, and Puckett, who was then a lieutenant colonel, was ordered to South Vietnam for a tour of duty. He was placed in command of the 2nd Battalion, 502nd Infantry Airborne Unit of the 101st Airborne Division, where his tour of duty in Vietnam, honestly, was a lot more eventful and dangerous than even his one short tour of duty in Korea. In fact, he was awarded a 2nd Distinguished Service Cross for his heroic leadership in August of 1967, and that was awarded because during a firefight near the town of Dak Phu, South Vietnam, he exposed himself to intense enemy fire and rallied his undermanned unit to defeat Viet Cong forces. And it wasn't just for this one occasion that he was decorated for valor. In fact, he was decorated on several different occasions for all the secret missions that he was assigned to as a ranger in Vietnam. Now, Puckett would ultimately retire from active duty from the Army in 1971 after 22 years of service and as a full colonel. Now, for his service in the Vietnam War, he was awarded a number of medals, mind you. It was so many, you guys, really. You think this guy would be Superman or something. But for his service in Vietnam, not only was he awarded his second Distinguished Service Cross, he was also awarded 2 Silver Stars, 2 Bronze Stars, 3 Legions of Merit, as well as 3 more Purple Heart medals for his bravery and valor in various combat operations with the 101st Airborne Division between his tour of duty in 1967 and 1968 in Vietnam. It can also be noted that he was awarded a total of 10 air medals for his service in both Korea and Vietnam, doing various parachute jumps into enemy territory, as well as an Army Commendation Medal. So by the time he retires in 1971, Puckett is a very well-decorated war veteran of 2 wars. And he was very, very esteemed and accomplished, and everybody loved him, to say the least. Now, after retiring from the military, he would stay active with veteran groups and even go on to different areas where there was active war zones, like in the Persian Gulf and even Iraq and Afghanistan, to be a motivational speaker for Army troops overseas. As you can imagine, Puckett was a very highly decorated war veteran after he retired in 1971. And even though he wasn't a part of the U.S. military anymore, he was heavily connected with certain members inside the military, as well as other veteran organizations around the country. Well, starting in 2002, after some conversations that he's had with some of these people that he served with, as well as other friends of his within the organizations, started to push for his Distinguished Service Cross he was awarded for actions in Korea to be upgraded to the Congressional Medal of Honor. And y'all, you have to realize this is no easy task either. This has happened before in other conflicts besides Korea, like World War I, World War II, Vietnam, heck, even the modern day conflicts of Iraq and Afghanistan. It takes a very long time for the government to review the paperwork and details of a particular action before any medal is upgraded in any capacity, including the Medal of Honor. They have to go through paperwork, and they got to go through with a fine-tooth comb. They have to do all these things to make it official, but I am very happy to say all of that hard work paid off, because in April of 2021, Puckett's Distinguished Service Cross for his actions on November 25th, 1950, was officially upgraded to the Medal of Honor after President Biden approved the recognition, giving him the long overdue recognition that Puckett so deserved. Puckett received the medal from President Biden during a ceremony at the White House on May 21st, 2021, thus finally getting that recognition that he so deserved well over 7 decades earlier. Now, since his official awarding of that medal, until his passing recently on April 8th, 2024, He was the official last surviving Medal of Honor recipient of the Korean War ever, following the death of fellow Korean Medal of Honor recipient Hiroshi Miyamura on November 29th, 2022. Guys, this guy was a pure inspiration in maybe a not-so-known conflict, but he was an inspiration regardless. What Ralph Puckett went through during Korea and Vietnam is almost unbelievable, but I'm glad somebody had to. And to serve mostly in the Army Rangers for over 20 years, that tells you something about his commitment to his country, his men, and his patriotism. And honestly, I could not think of a guy more deserving of the Medal of Honor recently than him. I mean, he purely put his life on the line multiple times, you guys. That is incredible. This video is dedicated to all of our living and past Korean War veterans out there. Thank you guys so very much for your bold sacrifice and service to this country. We will never forget you guys. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you guys for tuning in for such an inspirational story. If you wouldn't mind, leave a like and subscribe for me, and most certainly stick around for next time. Thank you, everyone.